Ever since I was a kid, I've always felt like doors...
How old?
Sorry?
How old were you when you knew you loved doors?
Hey, welcome back to ScreenCrush. I'm Colton Ogburn, and these are all of the Easter eggs, references, and little things you might have missed in Severance Season 2, Episode 2. We are going to explain the ending of this episode and discuss why Mark is so crucial to the Cold Harbor project, and we'll discuss how he and Miss Casey are connected to the twisted and downright evil that is happening in the depths of Lumen, which I think is a metaphorical or maybe even literal 9 circles of hell. Now, I dove into that theory in our previous breakdown, but we're going to go even deeper after hearing Mark call his sister
Persephone.
That name drop, while seemingly an innocent joke, was a huge hint at the darkness that is rising from the depths of Lumen and the cult of Kier. And hey, by the way, be sure to check out our Praise Kier sticky note shirt up on the merch store right now, ScreenCrushMerch.com. So in the previous episode, we spent all of our time down on the severed floor, and in this episode, we got to spend all of our time up on the surface. Essentially, the previous episode was Season 2, Episode 1 for the Innies, and this week's episode is like Season 2, Episode 1 for the outies. And the titles of the episode match this theme by having last week's episode with only the Innies titled Hello, Miss Cobell, Miss Cobell being the name of their former boss on the inside. And this week's episode is titled Goodbye, Mrs. Selvig, Mrs. Selvig being her character's outside persona for the outie episode. But remember, unlike the Severed, who genuinely have split identities on the inside versus the outside, Miss Cobell was all an act. She was doing it to keep an eye on Mark and his family. She is not severed. And in this video, I want to talk about why Miss Cobell has such an obsession with Mark. Why is Mark so damn important to what Lumen is doing? And are they responsible for his wife's death? So this episode opens with the same sounds as the previous episode, the audio from the Season 1 finale.
We're not happy. We're miserable.
And we got to see the immediate follow-up to that Season 1 finale after Mark shouts, and God, I love the attention to detail here. They kept that awesome focal length change that they do in the elevators to show the outie morphing into the innie, but in this shot, they reversed it. See, the way they accomplish this cool shot is by changing the zoom on the camera lens while simultaneously moving the camera. And to achieve the opposite effect, you would just reverse the process. So you either move the camera toward the actor and zoom out, or move the camera away from the actor and zoom in. And what this does is it changes the focal length of the lens, which can change the shape of your face, or how the lens is perceiving the shape of your face. And I really appreciate that they did the proper reverse of the elevator shot when we see Mark's scout wake up on the outside. Okay, so in Season 1, Devon, Mark's sister, had a conversation with Mark's innie.
Inspectors or whatever. Is that a thing? Inspectors?
Yeah, they're inspectors.
And now that Mark's outie is back at the wheel, we hear Devon ask Mark what her name is, to which he says, Persephone.
Can you spell that?
Guys, I talked to some of the ScreenCrush crew and I learned a lot about Persephone, and holy shit, was this discussion eye-opening for what's really going on down in Lumen. In the previous episode, I talked about how Lumen is essentially representative of hell, specifically Dante's Inferno and the 9 circles of hell. This series is a commentary on the workplace and the work machine that we've created in modern times, with office work being dreaded and feeling like purgatory. Some people hate their jobs so much and feel so trapped that they'd want to undergo a procedure like Severance, which makes their innie self, their work self, feel even more trapped because they never get to experience the outside world. Now, there's also the imagery of the severed floor literally being underground, like hell, and having layers that go deeper and deeper. We know that below the severed floor is the testing floor, and I would assume it goes even deeper than that, perhaps 9 levels deep. Now, I don't want to rehash everything from our previous breakdown, but essentially I discussed how the 9 core principles of Lumen could be tied to the 9 circles of hell, and that the beast at the very bottom floor could actually be the corpse of Kier Egan. And this episode, with that name drop of Persephone, added so much to that theory. Persephone is the queen of hell, and she was kidnapped by Hades and forced to spend half of her life in the underworld. Like, literally, out of a 12-month year, she spent 6 months of her time in hell, and the other 6 months on the top side. Sound familiar? The severed individuals spend half their time on the surface and half their time down on the severed floor. Now, Persephone is also immortal, which means the cold embrace of death cannot even break her from this cycle, which ties into our theory of Lumen striving to achieve immortality. Now, with Persephone traveling between the world of the living on the top side and the world of the dead below, she was able to meet people while they were alive and then meet them again in the underworld after they died. So she met their above self and their below self, just like Devon knows Mark Scout, her brother, but now she has met his hell half, Mark S. And I am genuinely terrified for Devon and Rickon and their baby Eleanor and what Lumen wants with them. Remember, Miss Cobell disguised herself as like a lactation nurse for their new baby, so there's something going on there. So next we see James Egan, who we actually met in the season 1 finale. He is the current Lumen CEO and father of Helena. He says,
Fetid moppet.
Feted meaning to be praised by a crowd, and moppet commonly being used to refer to a young girl. And damn, is he pissed at what Heliar had to say. Next, we can see Dylan leaving work following the MDR uprising and Milchick having tackled him to the ground. He's got this ice pack on his head, reminiscent of this scene with Mark from season 1 when he was sent home with a band-aid on his head and a gift card. Now back with Helena, we hear her tell Milchick,
Let Kier guide your hand.
Now this gives us a look behind the curtain at how these higher-ups really feel about this Kier cult. The whole praise Kier thing is not just a fiction to keep the Innies inspired. People like Helena are actually part of this cult. We also saw in season 1 that Miss Cobell is a serious follower of this cult with her shrine to Kier. So next we hear mention of Natalie and how she's doing media outreach following Helly's speech. Now you'll remember Natalie from season 1, she's essentially a Lumen press secretary. In season 1, before watching her eerily serve as a middleman to communicating with the board, we actually saw her in early scenes of the first season defending Lumen's interests on TV.
I think it's exactly the condescending verbiage that I'd expect from a group trying to save people from their own choices.
So here Helly is asking Miss Cobell to return to Lumen following her having been fired for not disclosing to the board that Helly R attempted to take her own life back in season 1. Here on Milchick's motorcycle, we see a license plate similar to the ones we've seen before in season 1. The plate reads Remedium Hominibus, but that translates from Latin to mean a cure for mankind, which could tie in again to the whole immortality thing, a cure for mankind. What is mankind? You live your life, but one thing we all have in common is that we eventually die. I think Lumen is trying to cure that fact and accomplish immortality. Now, remember, all of these folks, going back to the license plate, they live in the town of Kier, in a state abbreviated as PE. Now, me personally, I always sucked at PE, but now, there's actually no state in the United States with that abbreviation, so it's likely that this is a fictional state created by the creators of the show, and this could be one of many hints that the Severance series is actually taking place in a reality quite different from our own. In the previous episode, we heard mention of Lumen operating in 206 countries, but in our reality, there are approximately 195 countries. Now, this is another hint that this show is taking place in an alternate timeline, one where history panned out very differently from the one we know. Now remember, Cold Harbor is actually a battle from the Civil War, one that the Confederacy actually won against the Union. And in this reality, we're seeing Severance essentially being legalized slavery, so it's possible that in this timeline, maybe the Confederacy actually won? But maybe that's not what's happening, because I think in that painting, we actually saw Kier wearing a Union uniform, so we're just gonna have to see. But I do think it's becoming kind of clear that the Severance reality is one that is like a splintered timeline with a very, different recent history, or perhaps a very distant, not so recent history. Now, this also all ties into Mark having been a history professor, and the Cold Harbor project he's been working on, like I said, being the name of a battle from the Civil War, as we discussed last week. And of course, Cold Harbor was once again mentioned by Helena in this episode.
Long enough to complete Cold Harbor.
So here we see Helena essentially taking the fall for her outburst at the gala.
I made the poor decision to consume alcohol while on a non-Lumen medication for an arm rash.
this had an inebriating effect.
And claiming that what she said was due to her being drunk. You'll notice that she is falsely and embarrassingly claiming to have drank too much instead of daring to admit any wrongdoing by Lumen or the Severance procedure. She views it as better that she be thought of as unprofessional than for the severed procedure and the Innies mistreatment to be realized and frowned upon. After all, Helena has seemingly been tasked with marketing Severance to the public and proving it to be a safe and effective procedure that benefits people. And it's clear that she is doing all of this to impress her father, so it's no surprise that she was willing to take the fall and make sure that no one believes Severance is bad news. In this recording, Helena says,
I'm committed to this company with every part of me.
To which I yelled at my screen, no, you're not. Every part of her is not on board. Heliar, who is part of Helena, is not dedicated to Lumen. She loathes Lumen. And Helena saying this in her video, lying to the public that every part of her is fully on board. This once again reminds us of her disdain for her Innie and how she doesn't view her Innie as a person or even as herself. Now, of course, in typical Severance fashion, we learn that the Innies are being lied to. Mark was told in the previous episode that his friends decided not to return to work, but in this episode, we learned that they were actually fired. And then the intro rolls. For the first time this season, we didn't actually see it in the first episode. In this intro, we see Mark wake up in his bed wearing his red pajamas. Warm colors like red and orange have been used throughout this series to represent the outside world, so it's fitting that he is wearing red jammies. But around his neck, we can see the blue work badge for his job at Lumen. Cool colors like blue are prominent on the severed floor, and they represent Lumen and they represent control. So I thought it was a nice touch to have this badge hanging around his neck like an albatross, because what is Lumen if not a weight around Mark's throat, pulling him down, like literally pulling him down into the depths of hell that Lumen represents. We can also see these colors demonstrated in Mark's fish tank here. We can see this fish tank with an orange fish on one side and a blue fish on the other, and there's even this line straight down the middle dividing the two, showing us again that divide between the Innie world and the outie world. So next we see Mark's swollen head as a balloon coming out of the elevator. This is of course in reference to his face being on the balloons in the previous episode and how this ballooned look mirrors that inflated look of an Innie's face when they go up or down the severed floor, all due to the focal length change that we talked about earlier. Now here beneath Mark as he walks around this puddle of water with floating green brains, which I think represents the exploration of his own mind, which could be exactly what he's doing with Project Cold Harbor. Anyway, under him we can see what looks like Helly, and as Helly runs one way, we then see the emergence of what appears to be Miss Casey running in the opposite direction, playing into the fact that Mark S has a relationship with Helly, but Mark Scout of course has a relationship with his late wife. Mark is being pulled in two different directions, just like he is when he's severed. Now in this shot, we see two Marks coming face to face and popping up behind one another, the Innie Mark and the outie Mark. But this could also be a hint at our theory that this guy lurking in the background in the first episode, he could also be Mark, and Lumen could be really dabbling in cloning tech in addition to their work to understand consciousness and master immortality. Now next we get a bunch of faceless babies in suits. This is actually really creepy when you start to think about the implications of these suited up faceless babies and juxtapose that with Miss Wong and baby Eleanor. Severance, like I said, it's all essentially about having the worker be slave to their bosses. We're seeing a literal child work at Lumen this season, and in the first season we saw Miss Cobell take great interest in young Eleanor. If Lumen really is trying to achieve immortality and create a society whose sole mission is serving Kier, then these faceless babies in suits would certainly represent a workforce of serving yes men who are essentially programmed to serve Kier from birth and having no true personality of their own, only the one that Severance or Lumen has created for them, hence the no face. And if you look here, you can see one of these babies crawling around Mark's feet, but it actually has the head of Kier Egan, once again playing into our theory that perhaps they are trying to resurrect him. So seeing Kier's head on a baby is like him being born again. Now, next we get a quick shot of a goat, a callback to the goats from season 1 and to this painting from season 1. Now, I think these goats are in reference to the satanic inspirations of an evil cult like Lumen, and of course those those ties to hell that we discussed earlier. And then finally we get this shot of the long dark hallway which leads to the testing floor elevator, and if you go frame by frame we can once again see Helly and Miss Casey flashing back and forth. So back at Rick and South, we hear them rationalize their way into thinking that Mark was talking about a baby Eleanor when he yelled, "She's alive!" And oh my god, can I just say how much I love the character of Devon? That look she gave Milchick and throwing the towel over the picture of Gemma? Perfect. So if you guys have been following our coverage, you know that I think Heliar has yet to return, and that the Heliar that we met in the previous episode is actually Helena Egan undercover. And this scene all but confirms that when we see Helena studying her Innie self, prepping to go to the severed floor and pretend to be her severed self.
Honey, you're cutting them wrong.
So next up we have Dylan's job interview, and I loved how the guy interviewing him literally looks just like him. And they even have this great shot where they're looking at each other from across the table, echoing the theme of the show and how there are two versions of every severed. So when Dylan reveals that he is severed, the guy got uncomfortable and he wouldn't hire him. And that reminds us of just how controversial the procedure is in this world. We even hear the guy say,
You want to circumcise your brain, that's your business.
Now that little dig might sound funny, but it really is the perfect example of the severance procedure, connecting it to a pretty controversial procedure in our own reality, circumcision. Now, next we see Devon talking to Mark at a diner, and we begin to see just how uncomfortable Mark understandably gets talking about his late wife. And this gives us a peek behind the curtain on why he underwent that severance procedure. I mean, we always knew why, but here they are really showing us why. And we learn a little more about Gemma's death. Not only did she die in a car crash, and Mark had to identify her body, but she burned. This to me makes it even more likely that Miss Casey may not actually be Gemma, but instead a clone.
Dark science. Cloning.
We've talked before that part of Lumen's plan to achieve immortality and the resurrection of Kier would be tied not only to the understanding of consciousness and how to transfer consciousness, but they would also need to master the creation of clone bodies to harbor that consciousness. Alright, so this guy from Lumen, he's following Mark around. He's lurking here in the diner, and on his hand we see a tattoo that reads Frolic. We saw the word frolic on this poster in the previous episode, and frolic is connected to the work that Mark is doing at Lumen. On the screen with the scary numbers, we can see bins that are abbreviated with Kier's 4 tempers: woe, frolic, dread, and malice. And these 4 tempers could tie into the 4-member team that makes up MDR. And you'll notice that this diner is actually Pip's, which of course we saw in season 1. So next we see Irving, who is being followed by Bert. But remember, these are their outies. They don't know each other, but we can assume that they have actually met, because in that season 1 finale, Irving was at Bert's, banging on his door, and then he wakes up doing that same thing when he goes down to the severed floor, which means outie Bert woke up banging on Bert's door. And that would mean that 1, Irving and Bert have met, but also that would mean that Irving was lying when he said he had been in all night watching TV.
Fine, they're showing Barbara of Seville on TV, so I've just been here.
And then we see, unlike with the others who were fired, Milchick manipulates Mark into returning to work.
The solace you have given him down there will make its way to you. It just takes time.
And then we hear Helena say this.
We need Mark S. back to work. Enough to complete Cold Harbor.
So they need Mark S. back to work to complete Cold Harbor. So I'm really curious, what is it about Mark that is so important to this project? And I think it might be as simple as his connection to his dead wife, which last week in the very end of the episode, we saw that Mark's work on the computer is directly connected to what's going on with Miss Casey, with Gemma down on the testing floor. I think that Lumen is exploiting Mark's grief and using him to understand the inner workings of emotion, giving them a tangibility for what I believe is their mission to resurrect Kier and make immortality an achievable state for all. And then we end the episode with a classic Cobell temper tantrum. So guys, that was our breakdown for Severance Season 2, Episode 2. Let us know what you thought about the episode down in the comments below, or you can at me on Twitter or on our Discord, link in the description below. I want to thank you so much for watching and invite you to join us at one of our live shows. We're traveling all around the country and we just might be coming to your area. Links are in the description below. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe, smash that bell for alerts. For ScreenCrush, I'm Colton Ogburn.